Hello painting students. So as you can see, I've got my blue background finished. I've got the sort of golden yellow gradients in the foreground finished. And now I've got my palette and I'm ready to mix my sort of yellow orangey type color. But I think I'm going to use a magenta and mix that with the yellow to make that sort of orange color. I'm going to use the back of my brush. I'm going to put the darker color into the lighter color because it's easier to add a little bit more of the darker color if needed than to add more of the lighter color, simply because it will typically take more of that darker color. I'm going to mix a little more yellow into it because I don't want it to be too orange. I want it to be more of a yellow orange so that it's not too awfully different from the other gradient. So that's pretty good in terms of the color that I'm looking for. Then I'm just going to wipe the back of my brush off. So it's a lot easier to mix your colors with the back of a brush and clean the back of that brush off. Plus it will waste less paint, which is always a good thing. So now I'm going to be doing a gradient on these sections here with some of the new colors that I have. So I'll show you how that will look. It's very similar to the gradients that you've already seen happen, but I do want to still just show you so that you can see the little differences there. So right now I'm killing the sticky on my tape, and then I'm going to go ahead and put some tape down right on top of my yellow gradient that is already there. Killing the sticky again, and then we're going to go ahead and put another piece of tape down, and I'm going to go ahead and tape off a couple sections at once. This area is still wet because I had just done the golden yellow gradient there, so I'm not going to tape that one off yet. So if it goes over the section that you need to color or paint, just kind of tear a little bit of the tape off there. And I'm going to go ahead and tear this tape a little bit thinner because I know I'm going to have the same problem on this other end. So you can definitely adjust the thickness or the thinness of your tape. So now I've got these 3 sections ready for painting. Just going to rinse my brush, dry that brush off, because remember with acrylic paint we do not want to use a whole bunch of extra water. And I'm going to go in directly with my magenta first, sort of around the hand of that frog. Not going to use a lot of the plain magenta because I do want it to mostly be sort of that yellow transition. So now I'm going to go ahead and dip directly into my orange while that magenta is still wet. Now remember, shading will definitely take layers. It will not happen all at once. The same is true even just of a gradient like this one, because as you can see, the magenta dries pretty quickly. So in order to get a really smooth gradient, I do have to go back over it a couple of times and chances are I'll have to go back over it once it's dry as well. So now I'm just going to do a little bit of that yellow-orange color that I mixed before I get into my yellow again. Then go directly in with the yellow while that is still wet. The key to mixing with acrylic and shading with acrylic paint is to keep it wet, which means that you do have to work kind of fast at times since it does dry quickly and it does not re-wet itself the way the watercolor does. So you do definitely want to kind of have a plan before you start painting. Now I'm going to go directly in with my white. So as you can see, this gradient is not perfectly smooth yet, but I am still going to go ahead and continue building the gradient. I'm not necessarily going to worry too much about making any one particular part perfectly smooth yet, and I'm going to be more concerned about getting the overall gradient on there, and then I'll smooth it out once it's there. Kind of smoothing it out now that I've got it all on there. Working my way back down here. And remember, you can use multiple brushes because you probably will have to use some multiple brushes on some of these smaller spaces. So that's a pretty smooth gradient. It's still not perfect, but it's pretty far along. So I'm going to rinse my brush off before I start the next one. And on the next one, I'm not going to use the magenta first, just so that you can see that it's not going to make a big difference, because the magenta ends up just being a bit of an underpainting. So I'm going to go directly in with my yellowy orange color. So as you can see, the biggest difference already is just that it's an underpainting, so that the first part of it would start out darker if it had the magenta under it. The same concept still applies. So I'm still going to be going in layers. I'm still going to move on to my next color while this one is still wet. It's just going to look a little bit different because it does not have that magenta underpainting. I'm going to go ahead and work my way back down a little bit. Add a little more yellow here to smooth out this transition. Get back into my yellowy orangey color. So once again, the biggest difference there is simply that one is a little bit darker at the beginning than the other. I'm going to smooth out this transition a little bit more. That's a little better. So remember, this one I'm probably going to have to do a whole nother coat of the whole transition, simply because having that magenta color in there is nice, but it does also make the transition a little bit more difficult. So now I'm going to do this next one a little bit more differently still. I do still have to add a little more tape there. And then on this particular section, what I'm going to do is go directly in with my yellow-orange color and then go directly up to the white and not have yellow, so you can see what just the two colors looks like. So each one of these is going to be a little bit different. But the main purpose is so that you can see some of the different combinations, the different shading, because this is the same way you would do shading on a smaller space. You would mix colors in advance, you would also mix directly onto the paper depending on what you need, and you would want to make sure you work wet into wet. It's not going to be the same as wet into wet with watercolor, but it will actually allow those colors to blend more. So as you can see, when I've just got the two colors here, I'm going back and forth a little bit more between those colors. To really keep it smooth. So there we've got three sort of gradients that involve a little bit more orange as opposed to the sort of golden yellow. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the tape off carefully so that you can see the differences here. And if you are using tape and the tape does rip your paper, do not panic. Just try to get it off without as much further ripping as possible, and then just paint right over where it has been ripped. It will be perfectly fine. I actually had to do that on a couple of these sections, and once the paint is dry, you can barely tell. So there you can kind of see the way that they're working together a little bit. And I would want to touch this section up and this section, so you will still have touch-ups to do, and that just involves retaping if needed, or just painting directly over something. But since acrylic paint is opaque, you will be able to fix those mistakes and those little bump ups, so do not stress about it, do not worry about it. Just get the painting on there, get as much done as you can, and then go back in and make those changes as needed.